if we're not to beg the question of what our criteria for emancipation are, and if we're not going to simply baldly assert some standard, we need to ground ourselves in our form of life and what it is about that form of life that is appealing to people, that they find attractive and that they see themselves in. I mean, first of all, if you want socialism, socialism, if it ever is going to work, it needs mass support. And one has to be able to appeal to the values that people already have and say, look, if you really want this, if you really want the freedom that animates our commitment to this form of life and to the horrific byproducts of that form of life, what we really require is a socialist revolution that would be better able to realize the demand for freedom that arises in and through bourgeois society than our current institutional configurations.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Gourevitch. I'm here in São Paulo, Brazil, as usual, and I'm joined by contributing editor to this podcast, Alex Gourevitch, who's calling us from somewhere in the northeast of the United States, I think I understand. And from a similar region, our guest today, Jensen Suther, who's a junior fellow at Harvard working in philosophy and literature. And it says here, a bit of an asshole, but I don't know whose notes those are. So I'll let the listener decide at the end of this how seriously to take that.
Yeah,
we can review that.
We have to be fair to Jensen. I called him that. That's
right.
Not a self-description.
Right. Well, you have to you have to adopt the term, diffuse its piquancy.
It was
anyway,
said unfairly and with love.
Excellent. Right. So listeners will probably be familiar with an episode we did at the end of last year where I spoke to Anna Kornbluh, who is the author of a much discussed book called Immediacy, or the Style of Too Late Capitalism. And I found the book quite interesting. There's a lot to get into there. And her book and her project with the book is appealing, I think. And you'll find out in just a second why I'm talking about someone else, a previous guest, when I'm about to talk to Jensen, who I am genuinely very excited to talk to, whatever Alex Gourevitch has to say about him. Because Jensen wrote a review of this book, and I thought I would give Jensen the opportunity to kind of take this back up. So let me just set this up for you, listener, if you aren't familiar. Her project with that book, Immediacy, I thought was quite appealing because it seeks to unmask all the talk about vibe and sensation today and to defend, for example, fiction against memoir and autofiction and confession, to defend mediation against immediacy, which I think entails an emphasis on thought, on reason, and as against affect. So she, places herself, and I think I'm taking the words here from Jensen's review, in a philosophical tradition from Aristotle to Hegel to Marx, as against the new nihilism of decoloniality or philosophical schools of thought that seek to dethrone agency or subjectivity. So that all sounds like good stuff. But Jensen, you took her to task in a review in Non-Site last year, and I put some of your points to her on this podcast. So I thought after her responses that I would give you the chance at a riposte. So here we go. One critical point that you make with regard to Cornbluh's work is that immediacy isn't just a style, but it's something that emerges, or isn't just a style that emerges at a certain stage of capitalist development, that is kind of now or since the 1990s or since the 2000s, but it's something that's a socially necessary illusion or form of appearance characteristic of capitalism itself. So maybe to start us off, you could talk us through this.
Yeah, sure. I think, as I say in the review, there are many points that Anna makes in the book, which I would want to endorse and I think should be made. The two main issues that I had with the book is as I sort of divide it in the review, like one is how she actually understands the critique of immediacy coming out of the sort of Hegel's work, and then two, sort of how she thinks about this in relationship to the historical transformation of capitalism, where she wants to claim that immediacy is a stylistic form specific to what she calls too late capitalism. So Jameson has a theory of postmodernism as a corresponding to sort of late capitalism. And so she's trying to develop this idea of immediacy style as the sort of cultural logic specific to what she calls too late capitalism. So on the first point, the basic thought is that, when she reconstructs Hegel's argument, she makes it seem as if at the beginning of the phenomenology, and Hegel has his famous opening chapter on sense certainty, that Hegel is offering, a critique of immediacy, that he's rejecting immediacy in the name of, something like mediation, rationality, conceptuality, etc. And the first point that I make against her is that this is not how Hegel's picture works. He doesn't start from the standpoint of mediation or conceptuality and then opposes immediacy. He rather asks the question, okay, if we start from a naive conception in which our experience of the world is just one of sensuous immediacy, is this a coherent thought on its own terms? Is this actually a thinkable, conception of how we experience the world? So Hegel undertakes an immanent critique of immediacy and wants to show that, even if you try to articulate or to imagine an experience in which everything is just present to you without concepts, without any sort of, mediation by our own cognitive activity. Yeah, he wants to say that ultimately what is revealed is an irreducible dependence on universals. You wouldn't so much as be able to say this or here or point to some sensuous thing in the world without already having some capacity for conceptual discrimination. But he also wants to say that immediacy is not just something that we throw away, that we move beyond. It's not a stepladder that we kick away, but he's going to want to show that immediacy is actually a constitutive moment of experience, of what it means to be a minded being. So on this sort of philosophical point, I try to show that, just methodologically speaking, she's a partisan for, mediation, and she's not sort of undertaking, what I would call like a properly dialectical or immanent critical, approach to thinking through the notion of immediacy. And I think this leads her to, the book becomes a kind of polemic that has to presuppose in advance a standard of critique that isn't actually justified or grounded. Where this is what Hegel's really good at doing, is showing us how, we sort of have to start presuppositionlessly. We can't take anything for granted. And only on that basis can we learn something about, the structure of experience and the nature of human mindedness. So that's like the broader point, is that, I think that the book falls short of its own Hegelian ambitions, and this has consequences,
I just want to make a note here, in fact, that I do want to come back to this later on in this episode to ask you about what the stakes are in these understandings of Hegel or not, because this might be material which isn't so familiar to listeners, or they might not really grasp, okay, well, maybe you're saying you got Hegel wrong. She said she said in her response to you that you, Jensen, got Hegel wrong. And I'd be interested in understanding what the stakes are in this sort of debate. But I think we might do that in just a bit, because I wanted to turn to some of the other criticisms that you make of her that might be more familiar terrain to listeners.
Okay.
Specifically, you criticize her for not tracing her apperceptions about immediacy back to the essence of what a bourgeois society of capitalist modernity. But on the other hand, and this is what I want to come on to, you criticize her for a sort of vulgar materialism, for basically going, the culture is saying this, and that's because the economy is doing this. And you're saying that's too much of a short circuit, that it needs more mediation, I think. That's what I've understood your critique being. Maybe you could explain this.
Yeah, I mean, on this point, I mean, so she has this account where she wants to say that in this phase of too late capitalism, circulation comes to predominate overproduction, and and she traces these various new cultural forms, autofiction, the sort of kind of theoretical work that someone like Maggie Nelson is doing, authors like Knausgaard and Rachel Cusk. And she wants to say that there's sort of a direct line between the sort of speeding up of the circulation process in this new phase of capitalism and this experience of immediacy that this produces in our economic form to how culture is produced. So she basically has a deterministic picture in which there's a one-to-one relationship between how the what the economy is doing, and then to what authors, artists, and so on are doing. And I think that the way that I position myself in relation to this is to say that that it's not the case that these are simply superficial kind of functions of the economy or of the predominance of circulation over production, but that these are ways of however inadequately, however distortedly, of trying to work through a set of historical problems. And that means that there's something both true about what these authors are disclosing. This is what makes them, I think, socially necessary. They are disclosing something true about our historical experience, who we have become. But also, there's another sense, and I think that she's right on this point. There's also something veiling and fetishistic about what they're doing. I think partly what the book misses is this positive moment, or what Adorno would call like the rational kernel, as it were, of this kind of cultural work. So that's broadly the thought, that we need to be able to locate possibilities for, again, a kind of immanent criticism, of these cultural forms, rather than opposing them from without, and by presupposing a certain standard like mediation, where then it sort of looks like, you're telling artists what they should and shouldn't be doing, rather than grasping, there is a kind of social necessity even to their mistakes. And this is the point that I think goes missing.
I mean, what is wrong with simply saying that a lot of this autofiction is crap and shouldn't be done, and it's bad art if it's art at all?
Well, I mean, I think that there's one sense in which, yeah, we can make that critical point. And, as I said, there's a certain fetishistic and veiling dimension. I mean, as I try to show in the Cusk part of the last part of my piece where I address Cornbleet on Cusk, that there's a kind of there's a kind of contemplativeness to how Cusk understands individuality. I think she succumbs to a kind of atomistic individualism, and distorts what it is to be a person and under our late capitalist neoliberal form of life. But at the same time, one has to understand why this mistake is being made, and why they are writing fiction in this way, and why it's taken up as something that matters, like why people are reading it, and why they are drawn to it, and why they see themselves in this in some way. So even in the case of Cusk, I think that despite herself, she is revealing something about the historical and social nature of the contemplative and atomistic model of individuality that she ends up representing. So there's both something true about what the novel is doing and false. And that's the basis for, something like a more immanent model of critique where you take the work on its own terms, you ask what it's trying to do and whether it's actually able to fulfill its ambitions. Whereas on the Cornbleet picture, she wants to say, yeah, this is basically garbage and we should just be doing something else. But then what's your standard for that? Where are you deriving your criteria for, artistic success? And, this is what I think is really missing from the account. And this goes back to the mistake that I identified at the beginning where, her reconstruction of Hegel, is one where she takes Hegel to be pro mediation and he's opposing immediacy from that standpoint. And I basically think that's the line running throughout the book as a whole.
Can I see if I can understand the critique here? Because I'm trying to decide for myself where I stand on this debate.
Yeah.
So there's one way of understanding what Kornbluh's saying that fits at least in part with what you're saying, which is that these kinds of art and novel and television shows and so on, they do tell a truth.
Yeah.
And she agrees with you, or you agree with her, I should say, that they tell a truth. But the truth on her account, it sounds like, is the truth of too late capitalism. It's just the truth of what it is to be drawn into lightning quick circuits of the circulation of capital, which are so fast, so temporally dominated that there is no time for reflection. There is no possibility of stepping back. That in some sense you're just a medium for the circulation of value at a speed, such a rate that in some sense you're not really an agent at all. I got that a little. I mean, hopefully that is an accurate description of her view. So one could say what you call her determinism, which does seem like a kind of determinism, is also the basis that allows her to say that the truth of this kind of art lies in the truth of what it is to live in contemporary capitalism. But then what she objects to is, well, all it does is reinforce that experience rather than provide us with a way of stepping back from that experience. And so her objection is, this is a failure of art to perform the function of art, which is, instead of merely confirming or just reflecting back to us our current experience, it's supposed to give us some standpoint from which we can understand and know it.
Okay, yeah. Let me jump in on this point because I think this is really the crucial point of difference. And back when she initially gave this sort of book presentation here at Harvard, and the review that I wrote was a response to that. So we'd had a public exchange about the book then. And one of the issues that came up, and I do talk about this in the third section of the review, is so there's the account of art that you're giving now, where you're saying this is what art is supposed to do. That presupposes that art has an independent logic that's not reducible to its determination by the economic structure. And just spell that out a little bit. The thought is that when we think about autofiction, you also have to think about autofiction as a response to prior aesthetic problems within the literary tradition So, these authors are coming up against, and as I talk about in the review, like, already, uh, you know, Beckett, for instance, in the 50s, is himself already doing a kind of like, autofiction, auto narration kind of experiment. And he's responding to, this general modernist problematic of the exhaustion of, prior realist forms of narration, where you do get this new emphasis on like the first personal. And one of the things that Kornbluh is arguing for throughout, and she's a scholar of Victorian literature, yeah, is that she thinks that what literature should be doing is the kind of grand realist third personal description and reconstruction of the totality of social mediations, blah blah blah. But modernism, like according to like the internal logic of like the tradition of the novel, it was coming up against the sort of sclerosis of those forms and showing that there is something inadequate about them, that they're missing something, that there's that we no longer have the kind of access to the structure of the world that those novelistic forms presuppose. So now we have to deal with the inadequacy of these prior representational strategies, and so art tasks itself with developing new forms of new techniques, new forms, etc., to better cope with and understand our social and political reality. And I think that you know one has to the key point of mediation is showing that the the sort of self-critique of the novelistic tradition, that is the way that the novel works through its grounding in and its experience of the economic shifts in our form of life. So it's not simply that literary form is determined by this base structure that exists underneath, and that this is just sort of an epiphenomenon, which is kind of how she treats it, but rather like you know art has an autonomous logic. It's its own distinct human practice. It has its own norms, and artists have their own self understanding about what counts as good versus bad art, what counts as a good versus a bad novel. And those norms and standards aren't simply reducible to the kind of third personal economic description that Cornbleet wants to give. So the thought would be that something like autofiction itself has to be understood as a way of responding to prior aesthetic problems, and it's only in and through its way of responding to those prior aesthetic problems that it has significance for what we're doing economically, what we're doing in this new phase, if we're in a new phase of the history of capitalism. So I think that the basic point I would want to make is that we can affirm the autonomy of the aesthetic, and this is also sort of what I'm arguing in my forthcoming book. We can affirm the autonomy of the aesthetic without situating art outside of society. In fact, it is if we want to understand art as the distinct kind of social practice that it is, you have to understand its own internal logic, its own autonomous logic. So I think that we need to understand, the task is on the one hand to be sensitive to the history of the form and why artists are making the decisions that they're making. And part of what it is to understand the decisions that they're making is to understand how collectively we're transforming ourselves economically, how we now are understanding what it is we're doing. So that's the sense in which I would want to oppose the determinism which I think contaminates her account as a whole, while also affirming the idea that, yeah, we do need to think about these things in social, political, and economic terms. But the only way to adequately do that is by attending to, you know, art's own autonomous, demands that it makes of itself.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I guess that response made me think that, so one response you have to the seemingly sort of deterministic approach to art of someone like Kornbluh is to affirm the autonomy or the relative autonomy of art as a social practice that develops not merely according to underlying changes in the economy, but its own reflection upon the development of its practice. And this shows up in changes in literary and aesthetic form. And we have to explain those changes by reference to agents reflecting upon and thinking about how to solve aesthetic problems. But you also have this other argument. I can't remember how much it shows up in the review or and stuff you said outside, which is a different kind of argument against the economic determinism, which is roughly not about the autonomy of art, but about the significance of things like decisive historical changes, such as the historic political defeat of the working class,
Mm-hmm.
and how that changes our understanding of agency as well as what we think the tasks of theory are. And when I think about, I love Jameson. I've liked the things of Cornbleet that I've read, but I've always been a bit uncomfortable with the way in which there's an attempt to kind of map aesthetic changes on to changes in the nature or structure of capital accumulation. And I think part of it is, even though I do think we have to understand how they're relating, and as I thought about it, there's always seemed to be something oddly apolitical about it,
Good.
which is that it's an attempt to explain the conscious activities of agents, namely art or politics or whatever, by reference to something that happens that seems to happen outside the realm of human agency. And so the economy itself seems to be this sort of black box, pre-reflexive, automatic process
Good.
that then gets reflected up.
Good.
And so it seems like when I say apolitical, it's in part that, but in part then it seems to miss how actually the material of the base is the activity of agents. And where the fundamental material change of the postmodern period, it seems to me, isn't necessarily the declining rate of profit or the rates of circulation, but in fact, the political defeat of human agency in its collective form.
Correct.
And that in some ways the most significant thing and once we're defeated collectively, even as individuals, it seems to me, we end up unable to give an account of ourselves co-individuals. And I would think that somehow that for all that I'm sympathetic with Kornbluh about what she doesn't like, because I don't like it either, the kind of just the fact that you have an experience becomes authoritative. I feel threatened, therefore I am threatened. I feel harmed, therefore I am harmed. That, the collapsing of all dramedies and structurelessness of political movements because nobody can really give an account of themselves. But it seems to me that to explain that by reference to changes in the circulation of value seem to miss this sort of really deep world historically significant effect of the change in the activity of the material, namely the defeat of the working class. So I was wondering how you would sort of, and I know you've sort of brought this up in your own thinking, so I'd be curious to know how you would sort of connect that to what you've said about Kornbluh. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're talking about is what, Lenin and Lukács call the subjective factor, which is that, economic processes are not just these objective mechanistic processes, but they are ways in which we're constituting ourselves subjectively.
Right.
Meaning that, part of what it is to live in a capitalist society and to sustain a capitalist mode of production is to understand ourselves as doing so to some degree or another. And partly what I take the historical point of the Hegelian Marxist tradition to be is that the only way that we can fully own up to, our own self-comprehending activity as sustainers of a capitalist form of life is through the constitution of a a working class that actually takes capitalism as capitalism. It actually understands itself as part of such a structure, and it understands what such a structure is. And that was sort of the historical task of I mean, this is what like a book like History and Class Consciousness is really about and trying to demonstrate. I think that the point vis-a-vis art would be to say that the kind of transition that I mentioned earlier, where, especially again in like the 40s and 50s with someone like Beckett, yeah, I mean, this is someone who is really trying to give an account of what happens to our individual self-understanding and self-comprehension when the social bonds and forms of collective agency go missing, that we need even to understand ourselves as the individuals that we are. So there's a deep inseparability between, and this is sort of a classic Hegelian thesis, that I can't understand who I am unless I'm recognized in that self-understanding by other agents. And this is why, we need collective forms of agency just to be who individually we are and take ourselves to be. So when you have the historical defeat of the working class, in the 20s onward, and you have the failure of this project of constituting a collective agent who could actually take responsibility for our form of life, could take responsibility for, what we're doing to ourselves, in this sort of unconscious collective way under capitalism. One way that this manifests is through these, one piece of evidence for this kind of failure are these sorts of artistic attempts to demonstrate that something's gone wrong and that we can, no longer achieve even the sort of form of individual self-understanding that would be required to live a flourishing life. And that's what I see going on in someone like Beckett. And yeah, I mean, I think that Kornbluh and Jameson, Jameson's part of his whole thing was to integrate the sort of Marxist tradition with the so-called post-structuralist decentering of the subject. And, we have to throw out this idea of subjectivity. It's a bourgeois residue. And, what the struggle for communism is really about is a post-individual, form of social life. And part of this is also understanding that, we're not the masters of our own houses. We're determined by the economy. We're functions of the economy. Art is a function of the economy. This is all determined. This is what we really have to realize. Whereas the point, for the Hegelian tradition is that something like capitalism as a form of historical and social activity would not be so much as intelligible at all as a social and historical activity unless it's grasped as, the function of our collective agency. And, and that's, again, what I think these sort of, a lot of these modernist experiments, and in a degraded and degenerate form, these recent autofictive experiments, they are trying to work through, how we can so much as be individual agents at all if we've lost this collective capacity to take responsibility for our form of life.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Gourevitch, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gourevitch, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of bunga bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.